Hi y'all. So I just wanted to make a quick video because for anyone who hasn't heard, um, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced this morning that he has plans to resign as leader of the Liberal Party and Prime Minister and effectively leader of Canada in the coming months, as soon as the Liberal Party holds an election to choose a replacement. So this is a huge deal. It is a huge deal because, as you know, the Prime Minister of Canada he's not really a president for them. He doesn't have quite as much power. Election dates aren't always fixed for the Prime Minister, whereas for the President, it's every 4 years. However, in Trudeau's case, the last election was in 2021, so he is kind of running up on a deadline. So in this video, I'm going to hopefully try and do a little rundown of history, and then I'm going to kind of try to explain what's next. So what the history of this kind of starts back in 2015, or really 2013. Trudeau took over for the Liberal Party in a very difficult time. They had at one point in the, I believe, 2010s or late 2000s, they had not even been the main opposition party in the parliament. So just for a brief explainer, the way Canadian politics works is essentially their version of the House of Representatives, the House of Commons. Whichever party is able to have the most seats, or in most cases establish a majority or a coalition between two different parties that establishes a majority, that typically is referred to as the government, and the government selects the Prime Minister. So it's kind of like the speakership in the United States. I know in recent years we've had a bunch of times where the Republican-led House of Representatives here in the U.S. has been like a matter of, is there going to be, a vacancy in the speaker? That essentially is what a lot of these politics, like Canadian politics, UK politics, it's essentially what they are on a regular basis. But in their case, the speaker is a much more powerful figure who has a lot of executive abilities that the speaker in the US doesn't have. And effectively, the Prime Minister, which is what it's called there, in both Canada and the UK, is effectively considered to be the political leader of the country. The head of state in a lot of these countries is not the same person as the head of government, as is with the United States. The head of state and head of government are two different people. Usually the head of state in countries like Canada and the UK, it is the King of England, King Charles III. Whereas a lot of countries like Canada that are like technically independent from the UK but still use the king as a figurehead head of state, they have a governor general who effectively is kind of like a representative of sorts that sort of represents the king in Canada. And it's usually like in Canada's example, it's usually a Canadian that does it. So, as I said, this history kind of goes back to 2013 when Trudeau was elected leader of like a Liberal Party, which was kind of struggling. Stephen Harper, who was a conservative, or was a member of the Canadian Conservative Party, he had been Prime Minister since 2006. And in recent years, he had just kind of become a very noticeable force in Canadian conservative politics. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Canadian conservatives had kind of, I think, felt left out of governance quite a bit just because of the prime ministership belonging mostly to the Liberals at that time. Canadian political parties, just for a little, and I know I'm kind of jumping around here, but just for a little fresher-upper of sorts. The Conservative Party was founded in the early 2000s to kind of bring together more right-wing element. I say right-wing as if I don't hate that usage, the right-left analysis. I despise it. But anyways, like, it would be considered to be a party made up of center-right and right-wing characters who kind of came together in the early 2000s and are like, if we're going to win an election and we're going to win it big, we need to be one party. And so that was effectively what they did. And up until recently, where Maxime Bernier's People's Party has been getting pretty big, the Conservatives, sometimes called the Tories, although I tend to see that that's less likely with Canada's Conservatives. In the case of Canada's Conservatives, up until recently, they've been pretty much the main, you could say, right-wing force in Canadian politics. Then there's the Liberals, and the Liberals, like, if you ask a lot of social democrats and leftists around the world, they will tell you Liberal Party in Canada is firmly a centrist party. It isn't exactly like it's more liberal than the Democratic Party in the United States. The Democratic Party follows a very modern liberal platform, but it tends to like disobey a lot of the tenets of liberalism, or it tends to really stray away from a lot of modernist forms of liberalism just because it's not politically expedient in the United States yet. Whereas in Canada, a lot of things like healthcare policy have already kind of been made more liberal-centric, so the Liberals more so are kind of a defender of that. In fact, JJ McCullough, a very popular and I think likable Canadian YouTuber, he points out that, like, in Canadian politics, nationalism, which is this idea of, like, our country is the best, is more commonly found among the Liberals than among the Conservatives, because the Liberals kind of have this adoration for the idea of Canada, and they want to really distinguish themselves from America more, whereas Canadian Conservatives are, they attempt to be, and like you could, if you're a liberal, you're going to disagree with this, but they attempt to be more pragmatic on the issue. They attempt to be more like, let's strip away all of that nationalist stuff. They definitely have been more nationalist in recent years in terms of sentiments, but they have a very different approach to it. They're not really as eccentrically nationalist like the Liberals and the Republicans in the United States. So those are the main two parties, but because it's a parliamentary system where you have, the ability for any parties to win seats. Okay, it's first past the post with each of their House seats, so it's not exactly like perfect of a political system. It's very flawed. But because every single House seat is up for grabs, and essentially that is what determines what their system is, Canada has developed along the lines of having several sort of third parties, you could say, that have a lot of political power, especially right now, and I'll explain that later. Canada, the thing is that, Canada is kind of considered to be a two-party plus system where they have two parties, but they have other parties that occasionally jump in and are a big deal. Whereas America is like more firmly a two-party system. It doesn't have that plus on the end of it just because America, like, we really don't have any other options besides the Republicans and Democrats. It is a very rare and... Sorry, my sister showed up. So as I was saying, like, one of the major things with Canadian politics is they have, like, third parties. And their major third party, we're a very stringently two-party system, whereas Canada is a two-party plus system. So they have third parties that kind of jump in here and there and make a difference. The most notable two, are the New Democratic Party and the Bloc Québécois. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I haven't looked it up. So the Bloc Québécois, which currently holds the third most seats behind the Conservatives and then the Liberals on top. The Bloc Québécois is a Quebec nationalist party. So it's a party that is entirely focused on getting Quebec independence from Canada, because Quebec is the very French province in relation to the rest of Canada, which is very English. And so there's a lot of Quebecers, or Quebecois if you're speaking French, who don't want to be part of Canada anymore. They kind of feel sort of like it's, like the country just doesn't represent them. And so this one party has essentially been set up to represent the whole faction, even though, like, if you go to like Quebec's like provincial government, they'll have like a bunch of different separatist parties, which are the parties that want to split from Canada, that have different beliefs. Like you have like a sort of center-right one, you have like the ardent socialist ones, right? So it's not always a single philosophy. It's a similar situation with Scotland, actually, with their Alba party. So anyways, so you have the Bloc Québécois, and then you have the New Democratic Party, which is the kind of party a lot of progressives in America would really want. It is a party that has kind of, I believe officially they are a democratic socialist party, but they tend to seem to be more like along the lines of social democrats. I haven't really paid much attention to them because they really aren't given a lot of attention in Canadian politics, especially today, where it's kind of Trudeau versus Poilievre. At least it was until this morning, I guess you could say. They're not really given as much attention right now in terms of like what they believe. And so I think that very easily could hurt them in the upcoming election. But I think generally, from my understanding, they're considered to be a party that is not really into the liberalism idea. They're more into the, I guess, what you would consider leftist ideas. And so progressives and even the hardliner socialists and communists, they're the ones that make up the NDP base. And then finally, there is like a fifth party and kind of a sixth party. The fifth party is the Green Party, which does technically hold seats in the House of Commons, but J.J. McCullough, who I mentioned earlier, kind of considers it to be like a cult of personality around, I believe Elizabeth May is her name, who has been kind of the de facto leader for a long time now. And then you have a sixth party, which is the People's Party, and it has been sort of a new, more conservative faction of people who, in the 2019 Conservative Party leadership election, after they lost to Trudeau, right? Or actually, no, this was in 2015 after Stephen Harper lost to Trudeau, which I'll explain. But anyways, the Conservatives had a leadership election. There were two options, Andrew Scheer and Maxime Bernier. Bernier was the more conservative option. The Conservatives still went with Andrew Scheer. He wasn't like unconservative, but he wasn't as conservative as more of like Maxime Bernier, who was kind of, Bernier, I wouldn't necessarily say he's where the Republicans are at, but he's definitely more closer to that. And he kind of wanted to push the party in that direction. So, Bernier, I mean, his People's Party, I don't expect them to win any seats unless, like, there are some people who just utterly hate, who are, like, big-time conservatives who just utterly hate Poilievre. Poilievre has been promoting a very similar brand of very conservative politics, at least rhetorically. I don't know exactly what his specific policies are planned out to be, but I know that, like, assuming Poilievre takes office, which right now it still looks very likely, he'll win the next election. He seemingly is showing a lot of similar signs to Maxime Bernier. So he's kind of soaked up a lot of those like more conservative voters. But anyways, now we get to the history part, because now we have the parties down. So the history part begins in 2013 with the election of Trudeau as Liberal Party leader. Trudeau is the son of a former Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, who was one of the country's more famous or infamous, depending on who you ask, prime ministers. He was also a Liberal. Pierre Trudeau was, he kind of was Prime Minister at a time when a lot of Liberal governments, like one after the other, had kind of popped in. You had like conservative Prime Ministers like John Diefenbaker, but you'd had like a lot of like, especially post World War II, a lot of pretty well-known conservative prime ministers, Louis Saint Laurent, Lester B. Pearson, although I think he served a lesser amount of time, and he actually, like, his falling from grace was ultimately what allowed Pierre Trudeau to take office. But anyways, Justin Trudeau he kind of had this personality, being the son of a former, famous prime minister. And so he carried with him a very, very popular sort of new liberal movement. And the 2015 election, I mean, it was a bloodbath. The Conservatives, with Stephen Harper, who had kind of become their champion, they got annihilated, and Trudeau became the prime minister. Now, in Canada, if you win a majority government, as in you win more than half of the seats in the House of Commons when fighting against all those other parties, it's called a majority government. And the majority government allows you to serve the max of 4 years. So you can hold out your government and you don't have to have another election for 4 years, assuming nothing crazy happens. In the case of, because every 4 years the government expires. You have to have an election once every 4 years in Canada. So Trudeau was able to have that government until 2019, at which point the new Conservative Party leader who was taking over for Stephen Harper was Andrew Scheer. Scheer was able to break Trudeau's majority, as in Trudeau in 2019 lost enough seats that he didn't lose enough seats to lose the prime ministership. He was still able to remain prime minister through like dealings with like the NDP and the Greens and all these other parties that would have preferred the Liberals over the Conservatives in charge. But Trudeau was able to keep Andrew Scheer from the prime ministership, but he lost the popular vote, as in Scheer received more votes than him. And he also, he lost enough seats to the point where he didn't have a majority government anymore, meaning he couldn't just do anything he wanted, assuming he had his party's support. And so, 2 years later, Trudeau and the Liberals decide, or just the Parliament in general, because again, they weren't the majority anymore, decided to have an election in 2021. And the new Conservative leader at this point was a guy named Erin O'Toole. And O'Toole, he was very much a very, I guess you could say, liberal conservative. He was somebody who wanted to shift the Conservative Party into a more liberal direction. Sort of like, he wanted to, go so far, closer to the Liberals that he appeared like a moderate, much preferred option compared to Trudeau. Because, after 2019, when the Conservatives won the popular vote but lost the number of seats, or lost enough seats to the point where they couldn't take the prime ministership, a lot of people really did consider the Harper-Scheer conservatism to kind of be somewhat to blame for that. At least that's my interpretation. It might not be accurate. And so they elected O'Toole in the Conservative Party in an effort to make it more liberal. This kind of led to Maxime Bernier's People's Party, seeing a new rise. But it never really got far because O'Toole was only leader for a couple years. And then in the 2021 election, he also had a nearly identical situation to Andrew Scheer, where he won the popular vote over Trudeau, but he didn't win enough seats. And so Trudeau, coming out of the 2021 general election, had a very weak, he had a weak minority government, but he was able to set up an agreement with the New Democratic Party, which I mentioned before is the more progressive party. And the two parties agreed, we're going to keep Trudeau in charge, and until further notice, we're not going to shut him out, right? We're going to keep him in there. So the problem the NDP ran into with this is they had to actually get stuff done with the Liberals, because otherwise they were going to be looped in and considered to be also a governing party. Because again, since 2021, they have been. I don't remember the situation in 2019, but I know in 2021, they became a governing party. So they're kind of looped in that situation. And as I'm sure you're aware now, they've stuck around. The Conservatives have had the time to elect a new leader, Pierre Poilievre, who has a rather French name. Poilievre is more on the conservative end of the spectrum, I'd say. He definitely isn't an O'Toole type guy. He is more so focused on, he's really been hammering a lot of very aggressive rhetoric And I'm not saying like rhetoric like Trump's where it's like this is borderline inappropriate. He has remained very appropriate, but he has very much, I think, taken on a very Reagan-like strategy to things where he's trying to be smooth, but he's also trying to like really, appeal to Canadians with every word that he says. And it's worked so far. They have gone from a party that is, slightly beating the Liberals because Trudeau is unpopular to now Trudeau is super unpopular because he hasn't held an election in 4 years and it's just gotten worse for him in the polls. He's gone from somebody that could end up like the previous two Conservative leaders to somebody who very likely would become Prime Minister if an election were held tomorrow. And so Trudeau and the Liberals, I think, have recognized in the last few months that this isn't going to be like the last two times. They're not going to be able to get away with getting reelected with a minority government. It's time to go. It's over. Trudeau, at the start of 2025, a few days ago, had been in power. He's been in power for almost 10 years now. Like, this is well beyond the time any president can serve in the United States. He has been a very long time leader, even though most of it, right, the last 6 years have been spent without a majority. So he hasn't been able to be, I guess you could say, as effective in what the Liberal Party wants to do. Eventually, especially here at the end of 2024 and start of 2025, there came a lot of pressure from his own party. Originally it was like the establishment was still kind of holding on to him because he was remaining prime minister and that's what they needed. But now the polls have gotten so bad and like he has had so much internal dissent that it really the only thing keeping him alive, right? After Chrystia Freeland, who I mentioned was kind of actually I didn't mention this, but she was basically the deputy prime minister and like a finance minister, kind of like the secretary of the treasury, kind of loosely. She when she resigned, that really was kind of a big blow to him. But as long as he had Jagmeet Singh, who was the leader of the NDP, on his side, he could feasibly hold on to power. The problem is that the NDP in the last few days has essentially said, nope, next time the House of Commons convenes, the next time we're all together, we're going to call a motion of no confidence, which is basically when a majority of the chamber says, we don't like the prime minister, we think he sucks, we are going to call an election and elect a new one. Probably. Sometimes it fails. Trudeau and the Liberals immediately were like, well, there goes our last straw. Like, there goes literally our last straw, right? We've been having the cabinet fall apart, or the equivalent to the cabinet. We've been having a lot of people in this country turn against us. We're very, very unpopular. And now we are essentially being threatened with a motion of no confidence when the polls are like at their worst, right? And the Liberals are kind of like similar to the Tories in the UK. They're in a position right now where they are trying to play damage control. They're well aware that, even if it's a majority government, they could easily get very wiped out by quite a bit in this election. And they want to try and mitigate that and have a substantial number of seats so they can lead a strong opposition when Poilievre takes office. So, essentially after the NDP news came out, Trudeau this morning has announced his resignation, which was kind of a surefire thing, because now he doesn't have the support of the government, he doesn't have support of the people, and he doesn't have support of his own cabinet ministers. So when those three things come together, you as a prime minister or any kind of a chancellor or whatever in a parliamentary system, you are kind of screwed. You are not in a good position when those three things come together, or even really when one or two of them happens. There's a lot you got to keep together in order to be the leader of a country in this kind of system. It's not like president where you get elected and you have 4 years locked down, assuming you don't break constitutional protocol. So, that's kind of where we're at right now. Pierre Poilievre is expecting, and the Conservatives are expecting, a wipeout. It's actually kind of similar to Labour in the UK, where going into election night, there was the expectation that like Labour was going to dominate the Tories and like possibly even wipe the Tories from the opposition. I wouldn't say that's quite what people think the Conservatives are going to do in Canada, just because, again, the seats seem to be favoring the Liberals a little more, just given how the Conservatives have won the last two popular votes but lost the seat counts. So, you know, it's definitely a situation where it's like you easily could see the Conservatives go into election night and possibly lose. Now, probably the biggest thing that the Liberals are trying to do is they're trying to stall for time. They're trying, like, Trudeau is no more. By getting rid of Trudeau, they can bring in somebody else, and they technically do not have to hold the election until October. Now, I watched McCullough's kind of quick thing today, and he basically said, well, you know, the likelihood that the NDP will still call an election as soon as, you know, the government is back in session, probable, very probable. And I don't know the specifics on that. I do see it as possible that Jagmeet Singh says, you know what, we're going to keep this government going until the end. We're not going to do anything crazy just because, I mean, yeah, you know, we have a new prime minister. Let's give them a chance. Let's give them at least a few months to maybe jump onto the scene and do something big. And I think the hope of the Liberals is that with a new prime minister, they'd be able to have the best possible scenario where this new prime minister, in the span of like a few weeks or even maybe a few months, is able to build some kind of public profile that keeps them from being so extensively voted out of office. So that even if they lose the election, Poilievre doesn't have as clear of a majority and the opposition remains like in a sturdy position. Or maybe even they somehow prevent Poilievre from having a majority. I mean, I think the probability that Poilievre at least wins more seats than the Liberals is like very, very high right now. But we don't know because we don't know who the next leader is going to be. Some names have kind of been thrown around. I think the top two right now that are really like in the polls, they're the two initial people that everybody's talking about, are Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney. Chrystia Freeland's like the clear favorite as of right now, just because she was deputy prime minister. She was their kind of equivalent to the secretary of the treasury. She was, you know, when she resigned, it was a huge hit to Trudeau. It was that kind of losing support of the cabinet type of deal. And then you have Mark Carney, who is another sort, like, he's really big into the finances as well. He was, I believe, governor of the Bank of Canada, and he actually was governor of England's bank, I think, at one point. He's been dabbling in the world of finances quite a bit. I think the issue with Carney is I don't think he actually has a seat in Parliament, so it would be difficult to have him as leader. They'd have to effectively, like, they'd really have to stand him as an MP. The reality right now is that until the election comes around, we don't know who's going to be the next Liberal Party leader and probably prime minister. It's pretty likely right now to be Freeland, Chrystia Freeland. Now, whether or not, you know, somebody else comes in, jumps in and makes a splash, I mean, it's very, very possible. I mean, there's a number of other names that possibly could jump in. It really, though, it comes down to ultimately what the Liberal Party establishment thinks is the best course of action, because if they decide to play it safe, let the Conservatives have the government and not go aggressive with this, you know, party election, and then essentially choose a new party leader when it really comes time to after the election, that's possible. I don't know. I mean, it's also possible they choose a more long-term leader who will serve as prime minister for a little bit and then return after 4 years and maybe try to challenge Poilievre in 2029 if Poilievre gets a majority. We don't know. It will be difficult for whoever gets the nod to remain if the Conservatives win a majority, which they seem likely to do right now. So, yeah, this election right now is kind of who takes the weight, who takes the whole situation and has to deal with it. We don't know if anyone's willing to, but we also know that if the person who does take it does a good job, they will effectively be able to have a pretty strong grip on the Liberal Party, assuming they do an amazing job. We don't know if they will, but so yeah, that's kind of an update on the situation. Hope you all enjoyed that little ramble. Holy crap, that was a lot of information in a half an hour.